Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the Egyptian New Kingdom age of Ramesses. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The river is rising. It has been rising for weeks now, slowly, patiently, the way the Nile has always done, swelling upward from the south, filling its bed by degrees, creeping toward the low fields on either bank with the deliberate certainty of something that has been doing this for longer than any human memory can reach. The water tonight is dark and carries within it the red sediment of the Ethiopian highlands, the soil of distant mountains dissolved into a fluid that will settle here, on these flat fields of the delta and the valley, and become the richest earth in the world. Egrets move ahead of the flood's edge as it advances, unhurried, lifting their feet in that particular slow-motion way of wading birds, as if the water itself were a thing worthy of consideration before being disturbed. Above them, the sky holds the last warmth of the day in long horizontal bands, amber at the horizon, then a pale and luminous green, then a deep clear blue overhead in which the first stars are already appearing, steady and calm in the enormous African sky. Welcome to Egypt in the age of the New Kingdom, the era of warrior pharaohs and immense temples, of golden burial chambers cut deep into the limestone cliffs of Thebes, of armies marching north into Syria and south into Nubia, of a civilization that had already endured for 1,000 years and was now entering its most brilliant and most confident phase. We know the New Kingdom roughly as the period from 1550 to 1070 BCE, 5 centuries during which the great dynasties of the 18th, 19th, and 20th pharaohs raised Egypt to a height of power and cultural achievement that it would never fully recover after it passed. The names of this era are among the most recognizable in all of ancient history. Ahmose, Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and above them all, in the imagination of his own time and in the record he left carved into every surface he could find, the man who called himself the Great Ancestor, the son of Ra, the beloved of Amun, the ruler of rulers, Ramesses the Great. Tonight we will walk slowly through the world he inhabited and helped to make, letting its scale and its strangeness and its peculiar, enduring beauty settle around us like the Nile mud settling on the fields, gently, richly, in the dark. But before we arrive at Ramesses, we must understand what Egypt was, what it had been for 1,000 years before his birth, and what crisis it had passed through in the generation just before the New Kingdom began. Egypt's geography is its biography. The country is, at its core, a river moving through a desert. The Nile descends from the highlands of Central Africa and cuts northward through a landscape of absolute aridity, cliffs of limestone and sandstone on either side, the desert stretching away to the east and west in waves of sand and rock that contain almost nothing capable of sustaining life. Within the Nile Valley itself, the picture is entirely different. The annual flood deposits a strip of black soil, the Egyptians called it Kemet, the black land, that is among the most fertile on earth, capable of producing 3 harvests a year when irrigated with care. The desert on either side, the Deshret, the Red Land, was a barrier so complete that for most of Egypt's early history it served as a natural fortress wall, keeping enemies out and keeping the civilization within its green valley more or less undisturbed. For most of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the first 15 centuries or so of Egyptian civilization, this isolation had held. The Great Pyramids of Giza were already ancient by the time the New Kingdom began, the product of a confidence so enormous and a labor so sustained that no later civilization has attempted anything on quite that scale of institutional will. The civilization that built them had developed writing, mathematics, medicine, and an administrative system of extraordinary sophistication, all within the tight geography of the valley. It had also developed a theology, a system of belief about death and the afterlife and the relationship between the human and the divine, that is unlike anything else in the ancient world, and that would shape the New Kingdom's most spectacular expressions of power and piety for 5 centuries to come. Then, sometime around 1650 BCE, the isolation broke. From the northeast, from the Levant, the broad corridor of land connecting Africa to Asia, came a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, a word that means something like rulers of foreign lands. They came not as a sudden invasion but as a gradual infiltration, entering the delta region slowly, establishing communities, accumulating influence, until they held enough power to declare their own dynasty and rule northern Egypt for more than a century. The Egyptians never forgot this humiliation. It entered their collective memory as a wound, as the experience that had made them understand, for the first time, that the desert was not an infinite wall, that the world outside was real and capable of reaching them, that the only safety lay in projecting power outward before the outside world could project it inward. The New Kingdom was, among other things, Egypt's response to the Hyksos. It was the civilization of a people who had learned, at considerable cost, that the best defense is a very large army and a very long border. The man who drove the Hyksos out was Ahmose I, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, the dynasty that opened the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE. He was probably a teenager when he began his military campaigns in the north, and the accounts of his courage at the siege of Avaris, the Hyksos' capital in the delta, come partly from the autobiography of a soldier who served under him, a man who recorded his own service in a tomb inscription with a detail and a first-person directness that makes it feel like a soldier's dispatch from a front line. The soldier's name was also Ahmose, and his autobiography is one of the oldest military memoirs we have, a man recording what he saw and did, describing fighting from boats in the delta waterways, describing the king moving through battle and the enemy falling before him, describing his own rewards of gold and prisoners, with the matter-of-fact pride of a man who had been present at a great event and wanted the wall of his tomb to know it. With the Hyksos expelled and their capital taken, Egypt turned its attention outward with an energy that the long defensive period of the Hyksos' occupation had suppressed. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty pushed north into Canaan and Syria, east into the Sinai, south into Nubia, the land below the first cataract of the Nile, called Kush, rich in gold and ivory and cattle and the prestige that came from controlling the trade routes of sub-Saharan Africa. Under Thutmose I, Egyptian armies reached the Euphrates River for the first time, a distance of 1,000 miles from the delta, and the pharaoh had a commemorative stele erected on its bank, a stone marker planted in the soil of a foreign land simply to say, "We were here, and we were not afraid." The Nile Valley civilization that had looked inward for so long had discovered the world, and finding it, had decided to rule as much of it as possible. Among all the rulers of the 18th dynasty, one stands apart not for military conquest but for something more quietly remarkable. Her name was Hatshepsut, the female Horus, as she called herself, the pharaoh who ruled Egypt for roughly 20 years in the middle of the 15th century BCE. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, the widow of Thutmose II, and the regent for the young Thutmose III, a child king whose minority gave her the opportunity to step forward and claim the throne in her own right. She did so with a completeness that is still striking. She wore the double crown. She wore the false beard of the pharaoh. She had herself depicted in temple reliefs in male form, with the masculine titles and the masculine posture of a king, while simultaneously being described in feminine grammatical forms in the accompanying texts, as if the scribes could not quite decide which convention to follow when both were simultaneously true. What she built tells us more about her than any title or inscription. Her mortuary temple at Deu el Bori, constructed against the natural amphitheatre of the Dhaban cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, is one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world, 3 colonnaded terraces rising against the sheer cliff face, connected by ramps, the columns of pale limestone catching the morning light and throwing it back across the valley below in a way that seems designed not just for visual effect but for a particular quality of illumination at a particular hour. The temple was approached by a long processional avenue lined with sphinxes, the sphinx body with Hatshepsut's face, and within its walls the reliefs include one of the most extraordinary documentary narratives in Egyptian art, the story of a trading expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious and probably East African country from which Egypt imported myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and living animals. The reliefs show the Egyptian ships arriving, the people of Punt with their distinctive features and their conical houses built on stilts above the water, the loading of goods including the roots and soil of the myrrh tree so they could be transplanted and grown in Egypt. It is trading history depicted with the care and the delight of someone who found the world genuinely interesting. After Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, the child she had displaced, came into his own, and he proved to be one of the greatest military commanders Egypt ever produced. He campaigned 17 times into Syria and Canaan, extending Egyptian control further north than any pharaoh before or after him, and the account of his first great battle, at Megiddo, in the Jezreel Valley of northern Canaan, is the oldest detailed description of a military campaign in recorded history. The Egyptian scribes wrote it down day by day, recording the council of war in which Thutmose rejected his general's advice and chose the most direct and dangerous route to the enemy, and the battle itself, and the subsequent siege of the fortified city, and the quantities of tribute taken, chariots and horses and weapons and prisoners and grain, all listed with the methodical satisfaction of a bureaucracy that believed nothing was real until it had been counted. He is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which is a comparison that diminishes both men but at least conveys the scale and consistency of his achievement. Let your breathing slow now, as the night deepens over the valley. The Nile is very wide and very dark by this hour, moving without sound through the plain below the temples. The air carries the smell of water and earth and the distant sweetness of acacias flowering somewhere on the western bank. In the cliffs above Thebes, the great city on the bend of the river that was Egypt's religious capital for most of the New Kingdom, the city whose name in Greek gave us the word for 100-gated city, the city whose temples are so large that the great cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris would fit inside the hypostyle hall of Karnak with room to spare. In those cliffs, the tombs are cut. The Valley of the Kings. We will arrive there in time. But first, let us stay a little longer in the light, in the living city, in the world that the new kingdom built before it buried its dead. Thebes, which the Egyptians called Waset, and which is modern Luxor, was divided by the river in the most deliberate possible way. The east bank, where the sun rose, was the city of the living, temples and palaces and administrative buildings and the great bazaars and workshops of a city that was, at its height, perhaps one of the largest in the world. The west bank, where the sun set, was the city of the dead, the mortuary temples where the dead pharaohs received their eternal offerings, and behind them, in the hills and the valleys of the limestone plateau, the tombs. Life and death, organized geographically around the movement of the sun. The east for beginnings, the west for endings, the river in between as the threshold that everything must eventually cross. On the east bank, Karnak is the place that demands the most time and the most silence to absorb properly. It is not a single temple but an accumulation of temples, a complex of sanctuaries and pylons and obelisks and lakes and processional avenues built and rebuilt and added to by almost every pharaoh of the new kingdom and beyond, over a period of more than 1,000 years, until the total area of the complex covers roughly 200 acres. To walk into it today, past the ram-headed sphinxes of the avenue leading from the river, through the first great pylon and into the forecourt, is to enter a space so vast that perspective itself becomes unreliable. The columns in the hypostyle hall, 134 of them in 16 rows, are so tall that the light falls in from clerestory windows above and touches the floor in slanted columns that move across the carved and painted surfaces as the sun moves outside. The columns are 12 meters in circumference at the base, 12 meters, wide enough that 5 people holding hands could encircle one, and their surfaces are covered from floor to capital in carved and painted reliefs, every inch of stone carrying images and texts that have been slowly losing their color for 3,000 years and are still, in places, bright enough to make you stop. The Nile connected Karnak to Luxor Temple, a smaller, more intimate complex about 2 miles to the south, by a processional avenue lined on both sides with sphinxes, the whole length of it, nearly 2 miles of stone figures standing guard over the path that the priests walked during the Opit festival, the great annual celebration in which the statue of the god Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor and back again. Imagine this procession at its height, the priests in white linen, their heads shaved, carrying on their shoulders the gilded bark in which the god's shrine rested, hidden behind its curtains. The crowds on either side, the sound of sistrums and drums and the voices of the chantresses of Amun, the smell of incense and the flowers that spectators threw onto the path. And above everything, in the blazing Egyptian sun, the statues of the pharaoh flanking the temple entrance, colossal seated figures of a scale that makes a standing human being look like a detail rather than a subject, figures designed to communicate not grandeur exactly but permanence, the sense that this person, this institution, this order, is not temporary, is not contingent, is as fixed in its place as the stone from which it was cut. Now we have arrived, at last, at the man who understood this communication better than anyone who came before or after him. Ramesses II, called the Great, called Usamatra, keeper of harmony and balance, chosen of Ra, came to power in 1279 BCE and ruled Egypt for 66 years, until his death around 1213 BCE at the age of 90 or so, by which time he had outlived at least 12 of his own sons and seen a generation that had been born during his reign grow old and die. He was perhaps the greatest self-promoter in the history of human civilization, a man who covered every available surface with his own image and his own name with such relentless energy that it can be difficult, sometimes, to see past the propaganda to the person beneath it. But the person is there, and he is interesting, and the world he inhabited is extraordinary, and tonight we will spend time with both. He was born to be pharaoh but became it earlier than expected, when his father Seti died while Ramesses was in his late 20s, already a veteran of military campaigns, already possessing the physical presence and the organizational intelligence that a reign of unprecedented ambition would require. He was tall by the standards of his time. His mummy, examined by modern researchers, shows a man of about 5 feet 7 inches, which in the 13th century BCE was considerable. His hair was red, or auburn, which surprised the researchers who first examined him. The Egyptians had contact with Libyan and Near Eastern peoples whose hair ran toward that color, and Ramesses may have carried that ancestry in his appearance. His face, even in mummified form, has a quality of compression and energy that makes it easy to believe the stories his own scribes told about him, a man who could fill a room, who could make a decision and stand behind it, who expected the world to arrange itself around his will, and who was surprised and inconvenienced, perhaps for the first time in his life, by the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh. It is impossible to discuss Ramesses without spending time at Kadesh, because it is the event around which his entire self-presentation was organized, the battle he turned into the defining story of his reign, carved and painted onto the walls of 5 different temples, Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, the Ramesseum, in a campaign of commemorative art so sustained and so detailed that it constitutes the most thoroughly documented military engagement in the ancient world. The battle took place in 1274 BCE, in what is now Syria, near a city on the Orontes River called Kadesh, a city that stood on the border between the Egyptian sphere of influence and the territory of the Hittites, the great empire of Anatolia that was the only power in the ancient Near East capable of matching Egypt's military strength. Ramesses marched north with 4 divisions of the Egyptian army, each division named for a god, Ra, Amun, Ptah, Seth, and fell into a trap. Hittite spies, captured and questioned, told the Egyptians that the Hittite king Muwatalli was still far to the north of Kadesh. Ramesses, moving quickly and perhaps carelessly, pushed his Amun division ahead of the others and made camp before the city. Then 2 more Hittite captives were brought in who told a different story entirely. Muwatalli was not far away. He was very close. He was, in fact, just on the other side of the ridge above the Egyptian camp, with his full army of chariots, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 war chariots, each carrying 3 men, the Hittite chariot being heavier and more powerfully armed than the Egyptian 2-man version, and as this intelligence reached Ramesses, the Hittite chariots were already coming over the ridge and through the camp of the Ra division, which had not yet fully arrived, cutting it apart, sending its soldiers fleeing in panic toward the Amun camp where Ramesses was. What happened next is what Ramesses spent the rest of his life carving into stone. In his own account, the poem of Pentor, an extraordinary piece of royal propaganda that is also, stripped of its inflation, the account of a man in genuine crisis, Ramesses describes being surrounded on all sides, his officers fled or captured, his bodyguards scattered, and himself alone among the enemy chariots with his horses and his weapons, and a god he prayed to with the specific urgency of someone who has run out of other options. He calls on Amun. He describes Amun's response as a sudden warmth and certainty filling him. And then he charges. Alone, or nearly alone, he drives his chariot into the mass of Hittite vehicles, fighting his way out, rallying the troops who had fled, holding the position until the Parther division arrived and stabilized the situation. The battle ended as something close to a draw, and neither side could claim a decisive victory. The city of Kadesh remained outside Egyptian control, and both armies eventually withdrew to their own territory. Muwatalli arguably had the better of it militarily. But Ramesses won the war of memory. The poem of Pentor, dictated or at least approved by the pharaoh himself, is a masterpiece of selective presentation, a document that takes a near disaster and reframes it as a miracle of divine favor and personal courage, suppressing everything that does not serve the narrative, amplifying everything that does, until what remains is the image Ramesses wanted posterity to carry, a king who faced the worst alone and prevailed through faith and valor. The 5 temple walls on which it is carved ensured that for anyone traveling through Egypt in the centuries after 1274 BCE, there was no escaping this story. You might not be able to read the hieroglyphics on the wall, but the image of the great pharaoh in his chariot, drawing his bow, the enemy figures tumbling in confusion below him, the sky above clear and divine, that image required no literacy to understand. It was propaganda in the oldest and most effective sense of the word, the sense in which a story told in stone outlasts the stones that tell it. Kadesh had one consequence that Ramesses probably did not anticipate in the heat of the battle's aftermath. 16 years later, in 1259 BCE, the two great powers of the ancient Near East signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest surviving international peace treaty in the world, whose text was found carved in hieroglyphics at Karnak and in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets in the archives of the Hittite capital. Both sides declared it an Egyptian victory and a Hittite victory simultaneously, which is what peace treaties between evenly matched powers generally require. The treaty established the border between the two empires, provided for mutual defense against enemies, established extradition provisions for political refugees, and was sealed some years later by the marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramesses, the first of what the Egyptians tactfully called chief wives from foreign lands. The treaty held for the rest of both empires' existence. Today, a replica of it hangs in the United Nations building in New York, because when the UN was looking for a historical precedent to display as inspiration for international diplomacy, this was the document they chose. Let the diplomacy recede now and let the building speak. Because the greatest legacy of Ramesses II is not the Battle of Kadesh or even the peace that followed it, it is what he built. He was the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, which means he was probably the most prolific builder of monumental architecture in the history of the world. His buildings and his additions to existing buildings cover Upper and Lower Egypt from the Delta to the Sudanese desert, and the most spectacular of them all is not in Egypt proper at all but in Nubia, at a place called Abu Simbel, in what is now the very south of modern Egypt, above the second cataract of the Nile, in a landscape so remote and so spectacular that it seems to have been chosen less for strategic reasons than for the quality of the light. Abu Simbel is two temples cut directly into the face of a sandstone cliff. The larger is the temple of Ramesses himself. Its facade, which is also its entrance pylon, consists of 4 seated colossal statues of the pharaoh, each one 20 meters high, carved from the living rock of the cliff face rather than built up from separate stones. The figures are seated in the posture of enthroned divinity, their hands resting on their knees, their faces carrying the particular serene expression that Egyptian royal portraiture gave its subjects, not individual exactly, not psychologically specific, but composed in the way that something timeless is composed, as if emotion would be a kind of transience unworthy of the scale. Between their legs, at the scale of children beside adults, are smaller figures of Ramesses's family, his mother, his wives, his children, placed there not as diminishment but as protection, sheltered by his enormity. The interior of the temple is cut deeper into the cliff, the hypostyle hall supported by 8 colossal Osiride statues of Ramesses, then a vestibule, then the sanctuary, the innermost chamber of all, where 4 figures sit in a row in the dark at the very back of the rock, Ra-Harakti, Amun-Ra, the deified Ramesses himself, and Ptah. For gods, 3 of them major deities of the Egyptian pantheon and one of them the living pharaoh seated among them as an equal. Twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, dates that are believed to correspond to the pharaoh's birthday and his coronation day, the axis of the temple aligns with the rising sun, and a shaft of light enters the entrance and travels the entire length of the interior to illuminate the sanctuary. For a few minutes on those mornings, the light touches the faces of all 4 figures, except Ptah, the god of the underworld, who stays in shadow. Whether this alignment was engineered intentionally or is a coincidence of the temple's orientation is a question scholars continue to debate. The precision involved makes coincidence feel inadequate as an explanation. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel was built for Ramesses's most beloved wife, Nefertari, a woman whose name means the most beautiful, and whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens on the west bank of Thebes contained some of the finest painted plasterwork in the ancient world, the colors still vivid after 3,000 years. The figures of the queen moving through the underworld with a grace and a specificity that makes her seem less like a generic royal figure and more like an individual person, whom the artist knew and was trying to honor. The facade of Nefertari's temple at Abu Simbel is unique in Egyptian architecture. Instead of showing only the pharaoh on a large scale with the queen as a small figure beside him, Ramesses had the facade designed with 6 colossal figures, 3 on each side of the entrance, the figures of Ramesses and Nefertari alternating and identical in scale. For an Egyptian queen to appear at the same size as the pharaoh on the exterior of a temple was without precedent. It is the most eloquent statement Ramesses ever made, in a life full of eloquent statements, and he made it not in words but in stone, and at a scale that was designed to last. The Valley of the Kings lies on the west bank of Thebes, hidden behind a natural pyramid of limestone that dominates the horizon and seems, from certain angles, to have been placed there deliberately, a natural monument marking the sacred ground beneath it. The valley itself is narrow and steep-sided, its pale limestone walls rising in curves above the dry riverbed of its floor, the silence of it complete except for the wind and the occasional sound of tourists in the present day. In the New Kingdom, this valley was where the pharaohs were buried, cut deep into the bedrock in tombs whose entrances were concealed and whose locations were known only to the priests responsible for maintaining them. The bodies within were mummified, wrapped in linen bandages, provided with everything they would need in the next world, food and clothing and furniture and weapons and jewelry and, above all, texts. The walls of the tombs are covered in writing. The texts that line the walls of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings are among the most extraordinary religious documents in human history. They are the words that accompany the dead on their journey, the spells and the prayers and the maps and the instructions that will help the deceased navigate the landscape of the afterlife, to speak correctly to the 42 judges who weigh the heart, to know the names of the gates through which they must pass, to transform themselves into whatever form the journey requires. The Egyptians believed that the journey of the dead mirrored the journey of the sun god Ra through the underworld each night, 12 hours of darkness during which the sun travels beneath the earth in his divine bark, encountering threats and challenges, before emerging renewed at dawn. The dead pharaoh made this journey alongside Ra, and if the spells were known and spoken correctly, the journey ended not in oblivion but in a morning, a rising, a return to light. The most famous tomb in the Valley of the Kings is not the tomb of Ramesses, whose burial chamber was discovered long ago and plundered in antiquity. It is the tomb of a minor pharaoh, a boy king who died young and whose brief reign left almost no trace in the historical record except this, that his tomb was small enough and humble enough to be overlooked by the thieves who emptied almost every other burial in the valley over the centuries, and when Howard Carter opened it on November 4, 1922, he found it exactly as it had been sealed, 3,200 years before. Tutankhamun. The antechamber alone held over 2,000 objects, furniture and chariots and beds and shrines and boxes of food and clothing and weapons and alabaster vessels and golden jewelry and everything a young king might need in eternity. And at the center of it all, nested within shrines, the golden coffin within the golden coffin within the stone sarcophagus, the mummy with its golden mask, the face of a boy, serene and faintly smiling, the eyes outlined in kohl, the headdress striped in gold and blue, looking up at the ceiling of the burial chamber in the dark for 32 centuries as if waiting for a light that, in 1922, finally came. What Tutankhamun's tomb tells us is what every less intact tomb in Egypt tells us, but louder, that the Egyptians took the afterlife seriously in the most practical possible way. They did not merely believe in it. They prepared for it. They spent years, sometimes decades, equipping themselves for it, accumulating the objects and the texts and the provisions that the next world would require. The elaborate process of mummification, removing the organs, treating the body with natron salts, wrapping it in linen bandages inscribed with protective texts, was not simply a preservation technique. It was a theological statement. The body mattered. The body had to survive, because the soul could not be fully itself without a physical anchor in the world, and without that anchor the dead person would cease to exist in any meaningful way. Death, in the Egyptian understanding, was not an ending but a transition, and the transition required exactly the right preparation, made with exactly the right materials, accompanied by exactly the right words, or it would fail. The Egyptians were also, beneath all the ceremony and all the theology, people who wrote about their lives with a directness and a warmth that feels surprisingly modern. The literature of the New Kingdom includes love poems that read like songs on a contemporary radio station, young men writing about their inability to think about anything except the girl on the other side of the canal, young women describing the way their hearts race when their beloved walks past. One poem, from a papyrus dating to the 19th dynasty, describes a young man so distracted by love that he cannot eat. His heart is like a door blown open and shut by a wind that will not settle. The imagery is startlingly fresh. The feeling it describes has not changed. There is a continuity here that runs straight from the New Kingdom scribes to any person who has ever been unable to sleep because of someone they love. 3,000 years of the same human electricity, the same restlessness, the same helpless attention to another person's presence. The scribes who wrote these poems were educated at schools attached to the temples, institutions called houses of life, where young men learned to read and write the hieroglyphic script that was the foundation of Egyptian administration and religion. Learning to write hieroglyphics was not a short or easy process. The script contained over 700 individual signs, each one representing either a consonant, a combination of consonants, or a determinative indicating which category of meaning the word belonged to, and mastering it took years of practice under demanding teachers. The school exercises that survive on pottery fragments and limestone flakes, the ostraca that litter the archaeological sites of Thebes, show students copying standard texts, making mistakes, being corrected, trying again. They show teachers who sometimes wrote approving comments and sometimes wrote what reads very clearly as exasperation. The relationship between student and teacher has not changed in 3,000 years, and neither, apparently, has the student's tendency to copy instead of compose. The workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived in a village on the west bank of Thebes called Deir el-Medina, a settlement of perhaps 70 households, all of them occupied by skilled craftsmen and their families, artists and plasterers and scribes and carpenters who passed their trades from father to son across generations and who were, by the standards of ancient Egypt, remarkably well off. They were paid in grain and fish and oil and cloth. They were provided with servants. They had their own court system, their own religious practices, their own social dramas and disputes and love affairs, all of which are documented in extraordinary detail because these were literate people who wrote things down on whatever surface was available, and what they wrote has survived. We know the names of their children and the details of their arguments. We know who borrowed a tool from whom and did not return it. We know that one worker named Paymeb was accused of seducing his neighbor's wife and stealing stone from the royal tombs and generally making himself a nuisance to the entire community. We know about the first recorded labor strike in history, when the workers at Deir el-Medina stopped work and marched to the nearest temple storehouse to protest that their grain rations had not been delivered for 2 months, sitting down in a non-violent demonstration and refusing to move until the payments were made. They were. The strike worked. Now we must turn to a disruption in the long order of New Kingdom Egypt, a disruption so radical and so strange that its reverberations are still debated by scholars 3,000 years later. In the 14th century BCE, before Ramesses, and before even his father Seti, there came a pharaoh whose name means something like effective for the Akhenaten, who did something that no Egyptian ruler before or after him attempted. He abolished the traditional gods. He closed the temples. He redirected the vast wealth and institutional power of the Egyptian religious establishment away from the 100 named deities of the old faith and toward a single divine principle, the Aten, the disk of the sun, the pure light of the sun itself rather than any god who inhabited it. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city built from nothing on an empty stretch of desert cliffs, a city he called Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. Akhenaten's religious revolution was not simply theological. It was aesthetic. The art produced during his reign, the Amarna art, as it is called, looks unlike anything produced before or after it in Egyptian history. The rigid, idealized, timeless quality of traditional Egyptian royal portraiture was replaced with something startlingly different: elongated limbs, broad hips, large heads, figures rendered in motion and in domesticity, the pharaoh playing with his daughters, his wife Nefertiti beside him, the whole scene bathed in the rays of the Aten, each ray ending in a small human hand extending down to touch the figures below. Whether Akhenaten's distinctive appearance in the art reflects actual physical characteristics or a new aesthetic program is debated. What is clear is that the art of Amarna represents a crack in the monumental surface of Egyptian ideology, a moment when something individual, something specific to a particular person's vision, broke through the conventions of millennia. The revolution did not outlast its creator. Akhenaten died after a reign of 17 years, and the backlash was swift and thorough. His son, the boy king we know as Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten and renamed when the old religion was restored, was 9 years old when he came to power, surrounded by advisors who understood that the Amarna experiment had alienated the priesthood, disrupted the economy, weakened the army, and undermined the ideological foundations of the Egyptian state. The temples were reopened. The old gods were restored. The city of Amarna was abandoned and eventually dismantled, its stone used in the buildings of other pharaohs who wanted nothing of Akhenaten's memory to survive. He was erased from the official record, his name chiseled out of inscriptions, his image defaced, his cartouches replaced with those of his successors. For nearly 3,000 years he was so thoroughly forgotten that scholars debating the heretic pharaoh in the 19th century CE were not certain of his name. The erasure had nearly worked. After Tutankhamun came and then Horem, a general who stabilized the country and oversaw the systematic dismantling of Akhenaten's legacy, and then Ramesses I, the first of the 19th dynasty, an old general who reigned only briefly before passing the throne to his son Seti I. Seti I was in many ways the preparation for Ramesses II, a great military commander who campaigned in Libya and Canaan and Nubia, a builder of magnificent temples including the mortuary temple at Abydos where the list of pharaohs carved on the wall is one of our most important sources for Egyptian chronology, and a man who trained his son personally in the arts of kingship and war. The bond between Seti and Ramesses was apparently genuine. Ramesses referred to his father with an affection that goes beyond the formulaic, and the temple he built at Abydos in Seti's honor, completing what his father had begun, is among the finest buildings of the New Kingdom, its painted reliefs still carrying most of their original color. a softness and a delicacy in the paint application that makes Abydos feel less like a monument and more like a living space. The Ramesseum, Ramesses II's own mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, stood for centuries as the most impressive building on the Theban plain. Its granite colossi and its painted halls visible from the river, its granaries capable of feeding not just the temple's cult but the entire city in times of shortage. The colossi of Memnon, the two enormous seated figures that stand in the fields north of the Ramesseum and that Greek travelers mistook for figures of a legendary Ethiopian hero, are actually the remains of the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, but they give some sense of the scale at which New Kingdom pharaohs expressed themselves in stone. The largest of all the Colossus statues of Ramesses, which once stood in his delta capital of Pi-Ramesse, was 63 feet high and weighed over 1,000 tons. It now stands in a Cairo plaza, moved there in modern times, still holding the posture of absolute authority, still wearing the expression of serene and unchallengeable power, still carrying in the proportions of its face and its hands and its crown the intention of a man who wanted to be larger than the world he lived in. The poem written by Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1818, prompted by the arrival in London of fragments of a colossal statue of Ramesses, imagines a traveler in an ancient desert finding nothing but two legs of a broken statue in the sand, and a pedestal bearing an inscription that reads, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And around the wreck, Shelley writes, of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. It is the great English poem about the vanity of human ambition and the mercilessness of time, and it uses Ramesses as its emblem of hubris brought low. But there is another way to read the same facts. The statue did not disappear. The inscription did survive, or at least its record did. The name of Ramesses is known to every schoolchild in every country in the world that has a history curriculum. The temples at Abu Simbel were physically moved in the 1960s, lifted in sections by an international engineering effort to save them from the rising waters of Lake Nasser behind the New Aswan Dam. That effort, the greatest rescue operation in the history of archaeology, was undertaken because the world could not bear to lose them. Shelley's poem is a great poem, but it may be wrong about the ending. After Ramesses, the New Kingdom continued for another century or so under the successors who called themselves by his name, Ramesses III, IV, V, VI, all the way to Ramesses XI, the number itself a tribute to the founder's prestige, each ruler hoping that the name would carry some of the power of the man who had first made it great. Ramesses III, who ruled from around 1186 BCE, faced the most serious external threat Egypt had encountered since the Hyksos, the Sea Peoples, a loose confederation of displaced populations from the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, possibly set in motion by the same climate disruptions and political collapses that ended the Bronze Age civilizations of Mycenae and Hatti in the decades around 1200 BCE. The Sea Peoples came by land and by sea, and the naval battle in which Ramesses III defeated them, depicted on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu with an energy and a specificity that make it the most vivid battle scene in Egyptian art, was one of the last great assertions of New Kingdom military power. Egypt survived, but barely, and the cost was enormous. The last 2 centuries of the New Kingdom are a story of slow decline, of diminishing royal authority, of increasing priestly power, of economic contraction, and the breakdown of the administrative systems that had held the empire together. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed systematically in the late 20th dynasty, not by foreign invaders but by Egyptians themselves, by men who knew exactly where to dig and what they would find, sometimes including the very workers responsible for guarding the tombs. The investigations into the thefts, recorded in papyri that have survived, read like detective stories, witnesses questioned, suspects named, property recovered, punishments meted out with a severity that suggests both genuine outrage and genuine desperation. The world that had produced the poem of Pentor and the Treaty of Kadesh and the Colossi of Abu Simbel was coming apart. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way things always actually end, slowly, unevenly, the center losing its ability to hold, the periphery going first, and then the middle, until one day the title of pharaoh means something different from what it once meant, and then it means almost nothing, and then it belongs to someone whose family is from somewhere else entirely. Let the weight of that ending settle gently around you as the night settles around the valley. History carries these transitions, and they are real, and they deserve to be acknowledged. But there is another way to sit with the end of the New Kingdom, and it is the way the river itself invites. The Nile did not stop flowing when the New Kingdom ended. It rose and fell, as it always had, as it did long before Ahmose drove out the Hyksos, long before the first pharaoh united the 2 lands, long before any human hand had set a stone on the valley floor. The river is indifferent to dynasties in the most generous possible sense of the word indifferent, indifferent the way the sky is indifferent, the way the light is indifferent, present equally for everything that happens beneath it without preferring any of it. The colossi of Ramesses stood in the flood plain, and the river rose around their ankles every year and receded every year and deposited its rich black sediment at their feet, and the farmers came behind the flood with their seeds, and the cycle continued, and the stone figures looked across the water with their serene and manufactured expressions and saw it all. What the Egyptian New Kingdom left behind it is present in the world in ways that no subsequent civilization has entirely escaped. The monotheism of Akhenaten, or something like it, the impulse toward a single divine principle rather than a pantheon, may have influenced the development of Israelite theology, though the connection is disputed and the evidence is circumstantial. The calendar that Egypt developed and refined, the solar calendar of 365 days, the basis from which the Julian and Gregorian calendars descend, is the framework inside which almost everyone reading this passage organizes their understanding of time. The concept of the week, the division of the day into 24 hours, the measurement of angles in degrees, these are inheritances from the ancient Near East in which Egypt played a central role. We live inside a system of measurement that was being developed on the banks of the Nile while Ramesses was campaigning in Syria. The image of the pharaoh, the specific visual language of Egyptian royal representation, the figure shown in profile with shoulders turned forward, the crown and the crook and the flail, the hieroglyphic cartouche enclosing the name in an oval border that signifies the circuit of the sun, the deliberate frontality and stillness of the pose, entered the visual vocabulary of Western art through Greece, which was deeply influenced by Egypt in its archaic period, and through Rome, which took from Greece, and through everything that came after. When we look at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, with its enormous seated figure of the president looking forward with an expression of composed and permanent authority, we are looking at something that traces a direct line of visual influence back to the colossi at Abu Simbel, the seated Ramesses looking out over the Nile with exactly that quality of composed and permanent authority, on the same terms, in the same posture, making the same claim. The night is very deep now over the valley. The Nile has settled into its night rhythm, a low, continuous sound that is not quite silence and not quite music but something between them, the sound of a large body of water moving through darkness without hurry. The west bank is completely dark, the cliffs above the Valley of the Kings invisible against the sky except where the outline of the natural pyramid at the valley's head blocks out a certain arrangement of stars. The tombs beneath those cliffs are very still. The mummies in their cartonnage cases and their nested coffins are very still, as they have been for 3,000 years, as they will presumably continue to be for a very long time after us. There is something in that stillness that is not sad. Something that the Egyptians, who thought about this more carefully than almost any other civilization, would perhaps have recognized as what they were aiming for: the body at rest, the soul traveled on, the name surviving in the stone, the work completed and left to the judgment of time. Somewhere on the west bank, in the limestone cliffs above the sleeping city, the painted walls of a tomb are exactly as they were left. The colors of the plaster, ochre and lapis blue and malachite green and the particular red-brown of Egyptian skin, painted with a brush made from a reed, by a hand that has been dust for 3,000 years, are still bright. A figure of the queen moves through a doorway with a lotus flower in her outstretched hand, her white linen dress draped in the specific formal way that Egyptian artists always rendered it, her face in profile but her eye shown frontally, the way the eye is always shown in Egyptian art because it must be seen fully to do what eyes do, must be seen whole, to see. The Ka bird hovers above her, its human face looking down at the body it belongs to with an expression of watchful tenderness. The Aten's rays fall from the corner of the frame, each one ending in its small hand, reaching toward the figures below with a gesture that is unmistakably the gesture of offering, the gesture of giving something that the recipient needs. In the dark of the sealed tomb, the hands reach and keep reaching, in the patient way of painted things, which do not need light to continue their work. Sleep now. The Nile keeps its ancient rhythm outside, rising and falling on the schedule it has kept since before the first pyramid was built. The fields on the east bank are dark and rich with the sediment the flood has left, ready for the seed that morning will bring. The colossi of Abu Simbel face the water, their great stone faces in darkness, their expressions unchanged by the night the way they have been unchanged by 3,000 years of nights, composure being the one thing that stone does better than flesh. And in the valley behind the western cliffs, in the warm dark of a chamber cut into the rock at the depth where the temperature never changes, the kings of the new kingdom rest in their long aftermath, Ahmose and Hatshepsut and Thutmose and Seti and Ramesses, all of them arrived finally at the stillness they spent their reigns carving out of the world, all of them given at last the permanence they built so much to claim. The river moves. The stars will slowly overhead. And the night, enormous and indifferent and generous, holds everything equally in its dark, the living and the dead, the risen and the sinking, the name in the cartouche and the name on the wind, all of it held, all of it kept, for a little longer, in the long patience of the world.